All right, Andrew Easton here, and I am so looking forward to our conversation that we're going to have in this video as a part of our Writing an AI series titled To Foster a Culture of Inquiry and Revision. And I'm so grateful to Katrina Gotschall of ESU 8 and Sarah Essay of ESU 10 for joining us for this conversation. This is a conversation by topic that we've sort of massaged and bantered back and forth about, trying to land on how we really think about this. Full transparency in from my perspective, coming at this particular topic, I felt like it was very, very important for us to start off by saying we have to help students see writing as more than just being an assignment. This isn't a math problem, very much to the Dead Poets Society. I think there's a quote in there somewhere talking about that you can't sit down and just rate this necessarily as a number and a score, but rather to see this as something that is a means of self-expression and a way to press into ideas. And we had an entire video in this series that spoke to that why. So I'd highly encourage you to watch that prior to watching this one, because I think it'll be a nice setup for it. But I'm really grateful from our conversations behind the scenes that Katrina brought this idea of civic engagement to this conversation. So we're going to start there. Katrina, will you talk a little bit about how you view this idea, the concept of writing as a parallel to civic engagement?
Yeah, so we were talking about just, what is the writing process? You have your pre-writing and your ideas, and then you put something on paper or on your screen, and then you revise it and you think through it as you're revising it, and you move ideas around or completely change ideas. And as a person who loves social studies, taught some social studies, taught, high school, ELA, I really parallel that to the idea of what does it mean to be an engaged citizen, where we think about our ideas and then we get information and it, might impact our ideas, and we shift our ideas, we revise our ideas. We might even publish our ideas at some point, but then we might change them again. Nothing is ever set in stone as a citizen. And Maya Angelou, she says, when you know better, you should do better. I kind of liken that to the writing process really never changes, and neither does your being as a citizen. That we're constantly evolving and shifting, and I think that they're a nice parallel.
Well, I think that's a really great way for us to frame some of the steps of the writing process, as you mentioned there. And that was something that Sarah outlined for us a little bit too, is that we have to be explicit in saying, okay, here are the steps that we are specifically talking about. And I want to note that in this document that we are sharing out, which I'll throw up here on the screen while we reference it, we've tried to do that somewhat on the third page of this document as we kind of get into the steps of the writing process and where AI can support that. But ahead of really diving into the AI conversation, let's just get to those pieces. Sarah, will you talk through how you think about writing in terms of it being really these 4 steps?
I think, writing really is a process. I think a lot of times we view writing as a product. We look at something that somebody else has put out there into the world. We look at books and articles and we think, that is writing. But I think writing really for all of us, and even the people who publish the books and the articles, it's a process. We think about what we want to write. We think about our thoughts. We consider how we're going to get that down. Are we typing? Are we writing? Are we speaking it to the world? And then we put it on paper. And then we ask ourselves, is this what I wanted to say? Is there something else that it makes me think of? Should I go back? Do I know, like Katrina said, do I know better? Do I want to go back and add what I think now? And so the process of writing, I think, is just iterative. It constantly changes. I think even published authors really look at what they've written with a critical lens, and they think, I could have done that differently here. I could have put something in differently there. And so I think it's really important for our students to know that writing is not just a product, it's a process that we should constantly be evaluating and changing, and that's totally okay. Nobody is ever happy with something that they've published and they're like, I'm done. We always want to go back and improve what we have put out there.
Yeah, that reminds me of a quote that I heard once that said, writing is never done, it's only due. D-U-E. And I totally agree with that. And, in the why video that we recorded, we got into the benefit of navigating that process. And so I don't want to go into there too far. But as you start to look through that language and think about, gosh, you'd hate for students to have AI replace any part of that, because then you lose the ability to not only self-assess or to, as you're engaged in reading something, be able to break it down for some of the pieces that are there or considerations. But back to what Katrina started this with, there's a transferable skill within that process, and that thinking and that type of critical engagement, back to the word that you had, that bleeds into our conversations and our chats with AI, which is kind of a weird sort of like looking at both sides of the coin, maybe. But as we get to that conversation then about where AI might fit with all of this, Katrina, help us kind of bridge that gap then between this think, plan, write, revise, and this technology that we would love to see enhance these steps, but not replace them.
Sure. I really think about this with, my own experience with teachers in teaching, where I had, students who out of the gate were excited about writing, creative writing. And then I had students who also came in with a story about themselves and who they were as a writer that was not positive. And they were very reluctant writers, and didn't feel empowered in their voice, didn't feel like they had something to say. And writing is a very personal process, whether it's informative writing, whether it's narrative writing, creative writing, it's a very personal process. And one of the first questions students would say, are we going to share this? There's so much hesitancy. And I think that that's a very normal reaction for a lot of students. And so I look at AI as sort of the tool that can assist in creating some brave spaces in those classrooms where students can talk to a neutral party that is not a peer, and they can take risks and they can ask questions that they might see as quote unquote stupid questions that they would never ask a peer to give them feedback on. They can play with language. They can learn to ask better questions. And those things can be very time consuming for a teacher in the classroom to really dive into the messiness that is the writing process. And also it can teach students how to prompt their own feedback and think through their own feedback without completely depending on the teacher to be the holder of feedback. And it's just an ongoing dialogue. And that's kind of, that writing coach that isn't necessarily the teacher. And I guess the role I see AI playing in that is that's part of the beginning stages that can maybe help build some tolerance to the process of revision, and also encouragement for students who maybe need it to take risks. And then perhaps you take those drafts, and that's where you start the one-to-one peer conversation, classroom culture. The second part of that is for the teacher to talk about the role that AI plays in that writing process and why it's there, and then have the students have conversations about the kind of feedback they're getting from AI and if they like it or if they think it changes the message that was intended. For me, that's really where the power of it is that whole messy process and just helping students build tolerance for it.
Yeah, and that's the heart with which we tried to put together the resources that follow and the videos that try to delve into those steps. Because as you mentioned there, as a classroom teacher that may or may not be familiar with this tool and the way in which it can, play a role in this process, we wanted to create 15-minute videos or less that share out thinking about how you might start to see those two come together. And so that's certainly at in the spirit of what we're hoping to accomplish with all of this. And so, Sarah, as you listen into what Katrina shared there, and you start to think about where the same question of where might AI fit in it all, how does that kind of land for you? What would you highlight?
Yeah, I think AI has brought us a lot of great tools for scaffolding and supporting our students, especially our students who might be struggling at any point in the writing process to get started, especially our students maybe who are struggling to put pen to paper, maybe they're going to use voice to text. I just think there's a lot of wonderful capabilities that we can use to boost students' comfort and stamina, like Katrina said, with the writing process. And then I love what you said about students making decisions themselves about whether the AI has improved their writing and they agree with it, or whether they want to stick with their own voice. I just think we need to also be very careful that we keep ourselves in our writing, and the messiness and the crazy metaphors maybe that we've written, or the long sentences that we've put together. While AI might want us to edit those, sometimes that makes us who we are. And it's a really powerful point that we were wanting to make. And so I think encouraging our students that AI is not always, the supreme authority. It gives us a tool that we can use to make decisions about our writing. And we don't always have to rely on our peers or our teacher to do that, but we need to make informed decisions about who we are and what we're trying to say, and then allow AI to help us if we choose to.
Wow, I'm not trying to put anybody on blast here, but I will say that I have talked to some educators who have said, I can tell that my principal got ChatGPT because now the emails all look a way that's disingenuine or read as such. And sorry to put that one scenario out there. It doesn't speak for all principals or all educators, but it is a concern, right? That you want to represent yourself well, but without feeling misrepresented, or to share what ideas you have in a different voice or tone. So how can it support what you're able to do, which means you still have to foster the ability to do that yourself. Back to the point of it. So as we kind of bring things to a close here, then I guess, Katrina, what have we sort of left out of this conversation for the limited time that we have that is worth noting on this particular topic of fostering a culture of inquiry and revision?
Well, I think something that kind of builds off of what you just said about not losing ourselves in the process of engaging with AI. I think we also have to think about the cultures and the systems of writing that we have set up for students since they're very young, and when they may be inclined to use a ChatGPT in replacement of their own voice. Is it because their primary experience with writing has been a compliance? They get a prompt, they respond to it, they hand it in, they get a grade, they move on and never revisit it. If that's been their primary experience with writing, it may take a lot of time and effort and collective efficacy to restore the culture of revision and inquiry into the classroom and to hold space for that. And I think that's something that we in education just kind of have to grapple with, saying that we want students to have this curiosity and this inquiry, but how will we create a system that holds space for what we want and allows students to engage in that process so that they don't just look at the writing experience as something they have to jump through to get a grade, and it's not an authentic writing experience for them.
And being specific in making sure that at each of these phases that there is feedback and the opportunity, maybe as you said, to have a little bit of autonomy or choice, or to be curious, and what might that look like, or questions worth asking in addition to where I fits alongside those. And before we started recording today, Sarah brought up a really powerful quote that I'm going to throw up here on the screen and let her kind of bring us home with. But there it is. And Sarah, go ahead and share with us what that speaks to you.
So, we're all familiar with Stephen King with his wonderful groundbreaking works of horror fiction, but he did write a memoir about writing. And one really powerful quote that I love from that text is he's talking about the power of writing and that we have a permission slip to write. And so he says, on writing, you can, you should, and if you're brave enough to start, you will. And I love that he elevates the word brave, because writing does ask us to be brave. We're putting ourselves tangibly into the world when we write. And so I think just helping our students feel safe in those environments, that it is okay to be brave and be vulnerable here. I just love that quote, and I think we can all take something from it.
Wow. So regardless of whether it's your skills that maybe cause that process to be a little bit clunky, or your brainstorming or ideas at any point in time, or the lack of feedback to round that out, or really the want to not be vulnerable, perhaps, that all of those can provide barriers that, from our conversation during this particular video, I've gleaned that we can leverage AI to think about how to support, to make that process something that becomes a process that students can love and get real-time feedback in. And I think that that's pretty powerful towards giving them the opportunity to own their voice and their ability to step into, I'll bring it full circle, civic engagement and conversations in the future. So, wow, so grateful, Katrina and Sarah, for your time. Thank you so much for joining us for this. And we encourage everybody to check out, again, not only our resource that we put together. And so obviously both Sarah and Katrina were involved in bringing this piece together. But if you're watching this on YouTube, you might not be aware that this is embedded within a 4-page resource that does kind of a deep dive on every step along the way. So thank you for your time. And we look forward to encouraging you to check out the next episode.